All right, everyone, thank you for coming out tonight. Really appreciate to see all these familiar faces, people that are really interested in these topics. So tonight we'll hear Australia's perspective on the Indo-Pacific and how we move forward as two nations committed to the region's safety, openness, and security. The strong U.S.-Australian bond has been forged through the crucible of many world events, and I'm confident that we will rise to the occasion once again in helping secure a free and open Indo-Pacific. In addition to AHS's efforts in deepening students' understanding of global issues, CUA is also trying to scale up a larger program dedicated to this mission. The Catholic University's Global Connection Series is going to bring together experts from around the world to address the challenges of our times. These conversations features the foremost experts on global challenges facing humanity, including ambassadors and representatives of countries such as Australia, Portugal, and Italy. Through Global Connections, students, faculty, and interested members of the university community will have a better understanding of world events that impacts us all. So I'm going to just go through an introduction, try to make it brief for the ambassador as much as I can. So Ambassador Arthur Sinodinos has served as Australia's ambassador to the United States since February 2020. Ambassador Sinodinos was previously Australia's Minister for Industry, Innovation and Science, and was a senator for New South Wales in the Australian Parliament from 2011 to 2019. During his parliamentary career, he also held other key roles in and outside cabinet, including cabinet secretary and assistant treasurer. Ambassador Sinodinos has served as the Prime Minister's senior economic advisor and the Prime Minister's chief of staff. Ambassador Sinodinos also served as senior economic advisor to Prime Minister Howard. He started his Australian public service career in 1979, rising to the senior executive service in the Department of the Treasury. And Ambassador Sinodinos was appointed an Officer of the Order of Australia for his service to politics through the executive function of government, to the development of economic policy and reform, and to the Greek community. He was made a Distinguished Fellow of the Australia and New Zealand School of Government in recognition of his promotion of public sector leadership in 2019. So let's give a warm CUA welcome to the Ambassador. Thank you. All right, so I'm sure this is something that's relatable to all CUA students here, and as they start their careers, no matter what it may be, but some are definitely interested in public service with the government. So in that spirit, what attracted you to a career in public service, and what experiences in your life pushed you in this direction?
Yeah, well, look, first of all, thanks very much for the opportunity to be here. I hope my accent is okay. It's understandable, Australian English. But thank you for the opportunity, and I'm here with Dion, who's studying here at the university and having a great time of it. So thank you for that. Look, growing up, two phases. First of all, when I was very young, from a young age, I was always interested in news and current affairs. I don't know why, but I was always sort of following what was going on. I saw politics as being important. And then I was going to become a lawyer, and I got the marks to get into university courses for that, but my parents didn't want me to leave home to go to Sydney for that. So I said, okay, well, I'll do economics first and then I'll do law, because I had done some economics and commerce at university. Anyway, I started doing economics, and I found that I really enjoyed it, because I found that it helped to explain how the world worked, and I thought it was also useful as a basis then for public policy. And so rather than continue with law, I did an honours degree in economics, and then when it was time to get a job, in those days there weren't that many jobs for commercial economists, private sector economists, but I was interested also in how you apply economics to public policy, so I applied for a job in the Department of Finance in Canberra, our nation's capital. And I ended up there, but that was just the first step. After a year, I got into the Australian Treasury, which is where I really wanted to go, because that's where you applied the economics. And that got me started on the road. I did that for a while, and then a friend of mine was leaving the office of the Leader of the Opposition in Parliament John Howard in his first leadership role, pardon me, in the late 80s. And he said, look, do you want to have a look at this? Do maybe a job as an economic advisor in a parliamentary office, sort of the equivalent of your Congress. And I'd been interested in politics and parliament and all of that. And I was more on the right of centre, so I thought, yeah, I'll try that for a while. I did that for a couple of years. I enjoyed it. John Howard got sacked, lost his job as Leader of the Opposition. I went back to Treasury. I became an Assistant Secretary in the Treasury. And then Howard came back as Leader of the Liberal Party, the main right of centre party, in the 90s, mid-90s. And I then came back to his office as an economic advisor. And then he won the election in a landslide in 96. So I became part of his office. I was the senior economic advisor. And then through a series, not of accidents or whatever, but of other people falling over, I ended up as Chief of Staff about a year or so later. And I did that job for 9 years. And I enjoyed that job because, you know, I've got a curious mind, so you could roam across the whole area of public policy and politics. And so it ended up being, in retrospect, quite an enjoyable job. It felt hard at the time, but I really enjoyed it. And then it was time to leave. I'd had enough. I'd been there a long time. So I went to Sydney, went into banking for a while at Goldman's and one of our big Australian banks. And then a few years later, people came knocking and said, look, why don't you consider, instead of being an advisor in politics again, come to the front line, be a member of the parliament. So I was offered a Senate seat in New South Wales. So I went into the Senate in 2011. I did that for about 8 years. And you mentioned some of the roles I had there. Then I had a year where I got really sick. I had a lymphoma. So I had to get treatment for that, chemo and stem cell transplant, all this sort of stuff. So when I came back, I got offered another ministry, or I could be Ambassador of the United States. I'd been offered that job once before in 2005, and I didn't take it then because I thought I was too young to be an ambassador. But this time around, I thought, no, maybe I should take it. My wife, very keen for us to do it. She was keen to do it in 2005. So I ended up doing that. Now, the long-winded story I've just told you is to emphasize that life can sometimes take you in directions you didn't expect. I enjoyed the politics and public policy, probably more so. I mean, I didn't mind being a senator and a minister, but my main interest was the policy, getting things done. And the thing I've enjoyed about being the ambassador is I can do policy without the same media scrutiny that you get in politics. And the main lesson I've learned out of my time as ambassador, because I had an economics and business background, is the last 3 or 4 years there's been so much happening in geopolitics that I've really learnt a lot on that side. And the other general point I'll make is you've got to keep learning. The older you get, the more you realise what you don't know, and be humble about what you do know. So for example, and this is an entirely different example, mental health. When I was growing up, mental health issues we tended to sweep under the carpet, right? Tell people, buck up, stiff upper lip, whatever. Today we realise how fragile the human mind is. And I've had colleagues in the Parliament who I didn't realise had issues, but they came out the last few years with their issues, and you realise how well people could hide it. But you had to respect that people are not often as good, as well as they seem. That's a bit of a detour, but the main thing I would say about you as you go through the early stages of your career is don't be afraid to try different things, and don't be afraid to take risks. Now, of course, you get to an age where, particularly when you have family responsibilities, you don't want to take uncalculated risks. But my point is, whenever I faced a choice in life, if I've taken the riskier course, it's actually turned out better for me, right? The things you'll always regret are the opportunities or the risks you didn't take.
Well, I think that advice is definitely well received by all of us, and you know, it's definitely going to be useful because I know that a lot of us are graduating seniors, so we're
Yeah.
thinking about what we're going to do post-graduation. And I think that's, really important to keep in mind is, make sure that you're, keeping yourself on the straight and narrow, and you're thinking about yourself and your own well-being too. So, yeah, that's great. So now, fast forward to your role as ambassador.
Yep.
Obviously, one of the central roles that you're playing right now is integrating U.S. and Australian responses to
Yep.
the Indo-Pacific and China, right? So can you give a little bit of historical context for Australia's place in the Indo-Pacific and how it's really shaped Australia's foreign policy?
Yeah. Well, of course, we're located in the Indo-Pacific. So for us, the seaways, the airways through Southeast Asia and up towards the South China Sea and Japan, very important because some of our major trade, particularly around resources, is into Northeast Asia, into China, Japan and Korea. So for us, issues around our continental security have been very important, and also what happens in our region has a big impact on us. Because we were originally a British colony, we sort of stuck out as a bit of a sore thumb in some ways in our part of the world. And there was often a debate that we're in Asia but not part of Asia. But what's happened in our foreign policy the last 30 or 40 years is increasingly we've reached out to other countries in our own region and sought to be accepted on our own terms as part of the region. But for us, in terms of our security, we've always relied on having strong relationships with major security powers. Originally, that was Britain, when Britain was the great power. The sun never set on the British Empire. The British Navy ruled the waves. And then, particularly in World War II, where Britain collapsed, and for example, when Singapore, collapsed as the Japanese invaded, the Australian Prime Minister at the time turned to the US and said, we need your help. Churchill at that stage was saying the Australian forces should stay in the Middle East to reinforce what was happening there. The Australian Prime Minister was going to bring them back to help defend Australia. We lost a lot of troops in Singapore. They were taken prisoner. And so John Curtin, then the Australian Prime Minister, turned to FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and said, we need your help. And that's when General Douglas MacArthur appeared in Australia, and he basically took over the Pacific War. And so Australia became this huge base from which American and Australian, some British, and other Commonwealth troops could then start to retake Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. And while the war in Europe was tough, the war in the Pacific, going from island to island, the Japanese, very persistent. It was a tough war, but it forged, on top of what we did together in World War I, a very strong bond between our two countries. And that was cemented in the early 50s when we signed the ANZUS Treaty, Australia, New Zealand, US Treaty, where we agreed to come to each other's aid if we were under attack, or at least consult on what we would do. So the US became our big security guarantor from World War II onwards. At the same time, we started to develop our trade with Japan, and then Korea, and then China. China for us was a huge boon, right? China, biggest poverty reduction initiative in history, what they did in opening up and developing their economy along market lines initially. But the result of that for us was our resources trade in particular. Iron ore is the main one, coal also, went through the roof. And it was like a super cycle for the Australian economy. So we became very, very dependent on the trade with China. They became our number one trading partner. And then what happened is, in those days, say the 90s when I was in government with John Howard, we always said our security relationship is with the US, our economic relationship is with China, our major economic relationship. We can have all these different boxes. We can have a human rights dialogue with China in a separate sort of place. It doesn't have to overshadow the normal relationship. So we thought we could just juggle all this. But what's happened the last decade or so is China under Xi Jinping became more assertive, more aggressive out there, as it starts to flex its muscles, and started to act in a way which we thought was not consistent with our national interest. So our economic and national security interests started to come into some sort of conflict. So we had to take decisions, for example, about whether Chinese companies should be part of our telecommunication system, because we weren't sure about how the information garnered through those systems would be used when it went back to Beijing. We had interference in our politics. We had one senator who was on the take from a Chinese billionaire who was part of what's called the United Front Work Department, which is the Chinese Communist Party's outreach arm. He was on the take. He parroted their lines on South China Sea. He warned that billionaire that his lines were being tapped by security authorities in Australia, which was the final straw, and he was exposed and he had to resign from the parliament. He was he was on the opposing side, but he was one of my colleagues in the Senate. The reason I mention that story is things like that made Australians feel like, well, it's one thing to have a relationship with a big country like that and be a good trading partner, but we don't want them interfering in this way and seeking to manipulate our politics, our public opinion, our information. So it's not been about being anti-China for the sake of anti-China. It's been about what is in our national interest. It's still in our national interest to trade with China, deal with China. The new government in Australia has reopened dialogue with China. We want a more normal relationship, but we don't want one where we feel like our sovereignty is being impeded. So my final point on this, what's happened in our region, the Indo-Pacific, arms race and everything else going on, it's actually brought us and the US closer together. The relationship, I don't think, has ever been closer.
Yeah, well, clearly, I think one of the overarching goals of both the U.S. and Australia and our allies and partners in the region is to really emphasize free and open trade. But then you also have things like BRI and nefarious foreign direct investment.
Yeah.
So how is Australia countering the influence of China, particularly with BRI and these other forms of...
Well, I'll start with the foreign investment. So what we did a few years ago is we have a foreign investment review board which looks at sensitive foreign takeovers of Australian companies or assets. And what we did a few years ago is we defined a category of national security businesses. And so for various sizes of these businesses, this board, it's like your CFIUS that you have in the federal government, would scrutinise the proposals to see whether a takeover by certain interests would be inimical to our national interest and sovereignty. And so that doesn't name any one particular country, but it looks at the national security implications of a takeover. And that's been working pretty well. Some people would say it's probably worked too well because it's been pretty restrictive, but as far as I can tell. But we needed something like that. And that's what's happening in this world today. Governments are increasingly regulating in these sensitive national security sectors. On countering things like BRI, the challenge for us with BRI was very deep pockets by the Chinese, loans that are not subject to normal commercial criteria in terms of the projects being backed. The risk for countries that undertook these projects was that they incur all this debt for white elephants or uneconomic projects. So the economy doesn't grow in proportion to the debt burden that they're taking on. The result of that is they become increasingly indebted, and that impacts on their national sovereignty. Any country that's indebted, particularly a smaller country, has less room for manoeuvre, and it makes their lenders, whoever those lenders may be, able to exert undue influence over that country. The way to counter that, in the West, we don't operate the same way. We're not as centralised in terms of how we allocate funds. Major countries, and Australia and Japan and the US are part of this, we have trilateral infrastructure partnerships where we pool money and help develop projects. The main challenge in infrastructure in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, where we do a lot of this, is having bankable projects, creating a sort of pipeline of bankable projects. Because the money, you can find the money, but you've got to have that pipeline of projects. But the other issue we face compared to China, which can make centralized decisions, is that if it's 3 governments or 7 governments, like the G7, everybody having to agree to fund this or that, it's more complicated. I've always thought the best way to counter the BRI is to have a human capital version of the BRI where we really put our resources into education and capacity building. Because the biggest issue in a lot of less developed countries, a lot of fragile states, is they lack institutional muscle and capacity to deliver things. So that's an area we're putting more focus in, say, the Pacific Islands, along with the US. But I think the other thing that's happened with the Chinese is they've pulled back on BRI because they've realised some of the projects they're funding are a waste. And also some countries have seen the impact of debt and have said, we don't want to be part of this.
Yeah, so kind of now looking at some different implications other than trade and the economy in the Indo-Pacific, I'm looking more at defense, especially when it comes to Taiwan. Obviously, that's been a very leading issue.
Taiwan.
Taiwan. But it really is a pressing issue, as you know. And just, considering this, what is Australia's position on the defense of Taiwan?
Look, the US and Australia, we are status quo powers when it comes to Taiwan. And by that I mean, we think the current arrangement is a good arrangement. If there were to be change, it should be peaceful and by mutual consent. We don't believe that it should be done under duress. So what we do, everything we do is focus not on bringing on a conflict, it's to actually avoid a conflict by having a deterrent effect, whether it's through what we do in defense cooperation, and the US takes the lead on that with Taiwan, whether it's economic and trade development, the US and we obviously trade with Taiwan. The US is upgrading its trade agreement with Taiwan at the moment. We help Taiwan in international fora where we think it can contribute, like the WHO. We wanted them there as an observer because of the success they had with COVID. So basically what we're trying to do is give them space and autonomy. We all know what people's red lines are. In the case of Beijing, the red line for them is if Taipei unilaterally announced independence, for example. But no one in the West is pushing that. That's why I say we're status quo powers. But by strengthening Taiwan, we make it sure that if it's dealing with China, it's doing from a position of strength and not under duress. Where that all ends up, I don't know, but the way it's been characterized to me is that we should be undertaking actions which make Xi wake up in the morning, Xi Jinping, and say, today's not the day to do something on Taiwan. Kick the can down the road and we'll see.
Yeah, so now not so much looking at just Taiwan or one aspect of the Indo-Pacific, regionally speaking. Can you go into a little bit about how the Five Eyes kind of aids in not only the defense of Taiwan and but really also just ensuring a free and open Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, well, the Five Eyes is the intelligence relationship between Australia, America, UK, New Zealand, and Canada, right? It sort of originated in the Cold War as intelligence cooperation. It came out of World War II, but it was really the Cold War where it got going. And today it remains the preeminent intelligence relationship in the world, and very valuable to us in terms of our access to intelligence, but also we're very valuable to the intelligence network because of our location, where we can put our satellites. So, and there are a number of joint Australian-American facilities in Australia which provide really important information to the alliance. So the Five Eyes, in some ways, more important than ever, continue to evolve in response to technological developments in the collection of intelligence. They also have a bit of a look at the cyber field and how that is developing and the threats and opportunities that come out of that. So the Five Eyes continues to be at the heart of some of these major Western relationships.
Yeah, so now not only just looking at intelligence, but really the overall defense partnership that the U.S. and Australia share in the Indo-Pacific region, obviously considering how critical that is. How do you see the future of that relationship going forward?
On the defence side, we're about to announce the AUKUS agreement. That will cover nuclear-powered submarines. We're going to announce how that's going to happen, what the final design is, and what are the interim steps to provide capability until the subs are ready. The subs will give us a capacity to operate further afield from Australia. They're going to complement a range of initiatives we're taking around long-range strike capabilities. So AUKUS is about to hit. That's going to be important. Also, for the last few years, we've been agreeing more and more force posture initiatives. These are about how we operate together in the region, how we do more in Australia in terms of military exercises, what American assets can be based in Australia, particularly Northern Australia. At the 2+2 meeting, our defence and foreign ministers met, Blinken and Austin late last year for what's called OSMIN. They're their annual 2+2 talks. We agreed there that we would also do more trilateral exercises with the Japanese. So Australia is doing more with Japan bilaterally. We're now looking at how much more we do trilaterally. The Japanese are spending more on arms. They're more forward-looking in the Pacific now. It's been happening for a few years, but it's really accelerating now. And we're going to play more of a role with them in that regard. So that defence cooperation, whole series of fronts, is going to get even tighter.
Yeah, so just to kind of round us out here, kind of zooming out, not just in the Indo-Pacific and in that region, how do we rally the world behind ensuring a free and open Indo-Pacific region, and particularly with NATO and other countries that may not be aware of the threat that China poses?
Well, look, a couple of responses to that. The first is that the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and I know you're going to have the Polish ambassador here to talk about that soon, that rallied particularly the liberal democracies and the West, real moral clarity about what this was all about a country, a big country, trying to invade a small country in defiance of the UN Charter, trying to upend the global rules-based order. So Putin has done the West a great favour. He's united the West under American leadership again. He's made Finland and Sweden decide to join NATO. So he's doubled the NATO border with Russia in one fell swoop. The Germans, as a result, have announced they're going to rearm. They're going to increase their military spending in a way that you wouldn't have expected a few years ago. I was talking to someone from the Atlantic Council one night. He came home for dinner. And he said, I've been working on these issues for 30 years. I've seen more geostrategic change in Europe in 3 weeks than I saw in the last 30 years. So NATO has been revitalised and its relevance reinforced. NATO is also focused on what's happening in the Indo-Pacific, not in the sense that they want to create a NATO in the Indo-Pacific, but they're conscious, and the US is conscious, that what happens in Europe has lessons for the Indo-Pacific. And the lesson is you've got to show you're prepared to stand up when countries try and do what Russia is doing. And we're hoping that countries in the Indo-Pacific take that lesson. And also, just to round off the answer, the Quad leaders meeting now, very important, Australia, Japan, India and the US. AUKUS is happening. All these other trilateral things going on, as I mentioned before. So in a lot of ways, the US is really shoring up its network of allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. And the unique advantage the US has as a global superpower is its network of allies and partners.
Yeah, so just to close us out here and before we get to the audience's questions, what are some of the ways in which you see the US-Australian partnership and relationship going forward? How do you think we can make that stronger? You mentioned that we're very strong right now, but is there any ways in which you can see that we can make it even stronger and get even closer of a bond?
Yeah. I think the US doing more on economics and trade in the region is in both our interest, particularly with countries in Southeast Asia, because they say, look, we don't want to have to be asked to choose between America and China. But what they say behind the scenes is, we want the US in the region as a counterbalance. And the best way to do that is not just defense and security, but economics and trade, and create that integration. So we're very keen for the US to follow through on its Indo-Pacific economic framework and bring that to fruition this year. We'd love for the US ultimately to go back into the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which at the moment has 11 members. It's a market access agreement. The US hasn't done a market access agreement for a while, but we'd love for the US to be back into that. So economics and trade in the region would be really good. Look, while Australians and Americans have a number of things in common, we do have our differences in some elements of our culture, but ultimately what's brought us together is some common elements of heritage and also, I think, our values and interests. And two of the longest continuous democracies in the world, and all the wars we fought in the 20th century together have been wars to actually promote a global rules-based order rather than for imperialistic or dynastic domination.
Yeah, so now, if anyone wants to get up and ask a question, I just ask that you keep it short and concise so we can move along here. So anyone can go and go right on ahead.
Walk up to the mic and just ask a question.
Here's trouble. Go for it.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for coming. Around 2019, 2020, there was a lot of talk, especially coming out of the UK, about CANZUK, a growing of relationship between Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the United Kingdom. But that talk has seemed to die down a lot, especially after COVID and now with Ukraine. What can you tell us about kind of the continuation of that, or was it a Boris pipe dream?
I don't think it's developed quite in the way that was envisaged, partly overtaken by events like AUKUS, for example. But we're now seeking to find further ways to strengthen our relationship with Canada. We're looking at how much more we do together in the Indo-Pacific. They've just published a strategy on the Indo-Pacific. And in the case of New Zealand, we're very close, obviously, and they're also changing some of what they do in the region. So I think we're going to see more avenues for cooperation, and now I think a way of bringing the countries closer together in some of the areas that were identified. But you're right, we've got a bit of work to do.
Thank you.
Hi, so the United States has promised to defend Taiwan if China makes any move against them. Mm-hmm. What would be Australia's response if China makes a move against Taiwan?
I love your accent. That's a great accent. I don't know where you're from, but that's a great accent. Look, to be honest, what the US is saying and doing and what we're doing is create conditions in which, as I mentioned before, China thinks twice about attacking Taiwan, right? The whole point of what we're doing is deterrence, to create a set of circumstances where we don't have to answer that question, where we leave it as a hypothetical question. And I know, I'm conscious, for example, that at various times President Biden has come out quite unequivocally on this, but the official US policy remains one of what we call strategic ambiguity. And by that I mean they've left open what the American response will be, because as I mentioned before, and this is just a scenario, if there was a unilateral declaration of independence by Taiwan, and China then decided to attack, that's a different context. It would be seen almost as a provocation of China. That's a different context to what appears to be just a straight-out Chinese attack. I won't go into all the details, but context is everything. And so we're trying to abstract from the context and say, look, it's about deterrence. This is what we're doing, strengthening Taiwan militarily, strengthening Taiwan in economic and international relations terms, so that any consideration of a settlement between Beijing and Taipei is done peacefully and not under duress.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good evening, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you for coming in. I want to touch on something that you mentioned earlier, which was the previous relationship between China and Australia on economic terms, and how that's changed as China's human rights abuses have exacerbated over the past few years. I feel like there's similar conversation domestically in the U.S. We passed the CHIPS Act recently last year about economic investment. So my question is, how do you see Australia fitting into a potential decoupling between China and the West? Technically, and how that relates to U.S. and Australian relations.
It's a great question because there is a lot of talk about decoupling, but no one I think in the US or in Australia is talking about a complete decoupling between the Chinese economy and the West. They're too integrated. But what they are talking about, and what you alluded to, is there are some sensitive sectors, critical and emerging technologies, which are foundations of the industries of the future, where we want supply chains to be among trusted allies and partners. This is what we're pursuing in the context of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. This is what we're pursuing in looking at the integration of our industrial base with the US and the UK in the context of AUKUS. And this is what the US is pursuing through mechanisms like the CHIPS Act, where it's subsidizing the development of the chips industry in the US, complementing developments in South Korea and other countries to help sort of provide, if you like, complementarity to what Taiwan is doing and optionality. The whole US strategy is in competing with China is premised on investing in US infrastructure and US industries, particularly the industries of the future, so we don't end up in a situation where they've invested and gained an irreversible lead, whether it's in chips or in AI, machine learning, cyber, quantum. Pardon me, in Australia, we've just had published a paper where Australian scientists, and I put money into this when I was industry minister, looking at silicon bits for quantum computing, and they've shown that it can work. And if we get to the stage where we get a genuine quantum computer, that means that computer calculations will be much faster than they are now, which means it'll probably break down cryptography as we know it. It'll have to create a new cryptography after that. But these are the sort of applications that are coming down the turnpike. And we have to understand the implications of those and how do we sort of develop them in a way which sustains our national interest and national security.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good evening. Thank you for coming. I hope you don't mind if I read my question.
You're well prepared.
Just a little tongue-tied. What is the status of the Indo-Pacific coordination outside of the Quad and AUKUS members, and does it seem like many other countries in the region are concerned about aggression from the CCP?
Very good question. In terms of architecture in the region, the central architecture is the Association pardon me, of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, which is the 10 or so states in Southeast Asia. So that's a central part of the architecture. And we say the Quad, AUKUS, are not meant to displace, dominate that central architecture. We always talk about the centrality of ASEAN. And the ASEAN countries have strong relationships with China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, etc. That's the main piece of regional architecture. The Quad, we never say the Quad is an Asian NATO or an alliance or whatever. We say the Quad is about positive things in terms of development in the region, what we're for rather than what we're against. And it's certainly not meant to have a security dimension. And in the case of AUKUS, we say it's not a new alliance between Australia, UK and US. We have our existing alliance, ANZUS. AUKUS is a capability pact and capability development arrangement. So what we're trying to say to the region is we're not creating new architecture to displace what you do, it's to complement what you do and to give the region greater choice.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Doesn't matter how many, they can keep coming.
Alrighty, sir. Well, thank you very much for coming again. My question is, do you think that TikTok and banning TikTok should be a high priority for Australia as it is in the United States?
Yeah, it's interesting because we took the lead in saying that Huawei and ZTE should not be part of our telecommunications rollout under 5G. And the reason for that is because a lot of companies in China, or most companies, in fact, under the existing Chinese law, have an obligation to cooperate with their national security authorities. So our concern was the information that's being sucked back and how it might be used, right? And so when you look at TikTok, WeChat, anybody else, what you're looking at is they say, they are operating in the West, data's kept in the West, it's not taken back. There's been some issues with that here in the US. In Australia, I think we're still sort of, I'm not up to date with where those investigations have gone, but you've hit on the issue, which is this issue of digital authoritarianism. And part of the reason we want to negotiate a digital trade agreement in the context of Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is because we want to push back against that digital authoritarianism, because otherwise, by dint of its size, China's hardware and software can dominate the region. And then digitally, it's not just about whether they get information for intelligence purposes, it's also the fact that they suck up huge amounts of data, which they can then use to feed the AI, machine learning, and other stuff they're doing. And, as one of our former prime ministers said, once they got the capability, their intent can switch very quickly.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
This will be the last question. Just heads up.
You're the MC, eh?
Good evening. Thanks for coming.
Hi.
My question was related to Japan's rearmament. So obviously, since World War II, they've had a mostly defensive military kind of stance. That was their plan. And recently, they changed that to be willing to use it in defense of not just themselves, but other allied countries in Asia. I was wondering what Australia's thought was on that, and if it changes kind of the thinking related to Asian security at all.
We welcome what Japan is doing. We welcome the fact that Japan is stepping up, and as part of that, we're doing more with them, more military exercises, and with the US and Japan, we're going to do more trilateral military exercises. So for us, for a country of their size, they're really stepping up, and I think that's very important. So for us, the irony is Germany is going to be increasing its spending to 2% plus of GDP. Japan is putting its spending up over time. It's more forward-leaning and doing more in the region with us and other countries. So they're very impressive with the way they've turned around.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any last questions? We right?
I think that's it. Thank you very much for coming. We really appreciated that. Great talk. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. None of you fell asleep. None of you were smoking dope. So I'm pretty happy. Thank you.